Let's talk about someone special. A woman who was born into the greatest house of privilege, but decided to leave it all and disrespect the name of the world's most beloved woman. We're talking about Princess Diana's niece and her recent statements on turning 34. She was the niece of Princess Diana, the woman the world could never forget, and the family could never fully forgive. But while Diana's story was one of defiance and heartbreak under the crown, Kitty Spencer's story was written in a different kind of light. A life filled with wealth, fashion, and a polished distance from the very tragedy that gave her name meaning. For years, she was known only as the daughter of Diana's brother, Charles Spencer, and as the beautiful young woman who chose to smile in photographs the public wanted her to cry in. But now, at this age, Lady Kitty Spencer has finally spoken, and what she said confirmed what many suspected all along. Because Kitty wasn't just another aristocrat born into scandal, she was raised in the shadow of one of the most photographed women in human history. Yet, when the world looked to her for connection, to carry on Diana's empathy, her rebellion, her smile, Kitty turned towards something else entirely: control. From the very beginning, her family made sure her upbringing was nothing like her aunt's. Where Diana was thrown into royal chaos at 19, Kitty was protected behind gates, raised between London and Cape Town, and taught that the world outside could destroy you if you didn't control it first. Her mother, Victoria Lockwood, had once been called the model who married into the monarchy's boonies. But that place, as it turned out, was just as cruel as the palace itself. Victoria fled England to escape the tabloids, the pressures, and Charles Spencer's own demons. Kitty grew up in South Africa, far away from the gilded image of Althorpe House, the Spencer estate where Diana once played as a child and where her body now rests. By the time Kitty returned to England, she wasn't the innocent niece walking into a legacy. She was a woman carefully constructed not to repeat history. But history has a way of chasing you. When Kitty stepped into the public eye in her 20s, she didn't speak of Diana. She didn't attend royal events. She didn't capitalize on the name. And people noticed. How could Diana's niece remain silent while the rest of the world still wept for her? Some said she was protecting her family's privacy. Others said she was protecting her image. Either way, the silence grew heavier the more famous she became. Fashion magazines called her the new face of British elegance. Brands lined up to dress her. Dolce & Gabbana made her their muse. But the moment she appeared in diamond-studded gowns on Italian runways, critics turned. The comparisons to Diana grew colder, sharper, crueler. Diana had worn Chanel, but cried behind closed doors. Kitty wore couture and smiled with conviction. And to many, that smile said everything. But that wasn't the case. Everything was revealed at the marriage. In 2021, Kitty Spencer married Michael Lewis, a billionaire businessman 32 years older than her. The wedding in Rome looked more like a royal coronation than a family ceremony. 5 Dolce & Gabbana gowns. No members of the royal family in attendance, not even her father. And notably, no presence of Diana's sons, William or Harry. The world called it a statement. Kitty called it love. But it wasn't lost on anyone that the woman once praised for her resemblance to Diana had now chosen a life far from anything Diana would have wanted for her niece. And that's where the questions began. Was Kitty rejecting her aunt's legacy, or was she protecting herself from being consumed by it? The same tabloids that once hounded Diana now framed Kitty as a woman who had betrayed her memory, using luxury and detachment where empathy and humility once defined the Spencer women. But what they didn't see was the quiet war that had been raging inside her family for decades. Charles Spencer had spent years guarding Diana's memory like a fortress, publicly condemning the media and the monarchy. Kitty, meanwhile, had chosen to build an empire of her own, one not defined by pain, but by image. And that contrast became the root of every rumor that followed. When she finally broke her silence about Diana, it wasn't in an explosive interview or through a tell-all book. It was slow, almost unnoticeable. In a rare conversation, Kitty admitted she felt honored to share her aunt's name, describing Diana as the most inspirational woman the world will ever know. But her words, though reverent, lacked intimacy. There were no personal stories, no emotional ties, no insight into what Diana meant to her. Some said it was dignity, others said it was distance. But everyone felt the same thing, an uncomfortable truth beneath the polished sentences. Because what Kitty didn't say mattered more than what she did. Her Instagram feed told a different story, one that showcased a life of perfection. No grief, no politics, no comment on Harry and Meghan, no mention of the family's fractures, just luxury, philanthropy, and endless grace. And while that image made her beloved in fashion circles, it alienated the people who saw in her the ghost of Diana, a ghost that refused to speak. But behind the carefully crafted persona, some moments slipped through. Close friends recalled how deeply Kitty feared media intrusion, that she avoided discussions about Diana because of what it did to her father, how reopening that wound meant reliving a grief that had never healed. And yet, at 34, something shifted. In her latest interviews, she began to speak of the weight of her family name, the expectations, and the pressure to appear perfect. She admitted she had always wanted to live life on her own terms, that the world already had one Diana, and that no one could or should try to be her again. For years, people suspected that Kitty's silence wasn't indifference, it was rebellion, a refusal to be used by a system that devoured her aunt. And when she finally said it, that she never wanted to be compared to Diana again, it wasn't arrogance. It was a basic human right. Because for Lady Kitty Spencer, the only way to escape Diana's shadow was to step completely out of it. Before we get more into that, let's talk about marriage a little. By the time Kitty Spencer walked down that marble aisle in Rome, her world had already split in two. On one side stood the legacy of her name, the Spencer bloodline, the unspoken burden of being Diana's niece. On the other stood the life she built for herself, one of glamour, independence, and quiet rebellion. But between those two worlds, there was a silence that spoke louder than any royal scandal. The absence of her father, Charles Spencer, from that wedding wasn't an accident. It was a signal. Charles had spent decades positioning himself as the guardian of Diana's memory, the eulogist at her funeral, the man who condemned the crown, the press, and every force that had crushed his sister's spirit. But within the walls of Althorpe, the story was far darker than the one the world knew. His children, including Kitty, had grown up witnessing that grief turn inward, into guilt, distance, and resentment. Their mother, Victoria Lockwood, had fled England to protect herself and the kids from what she described as a life of unbearable pressure. Kitty was only a child when her parents' marriage fell apart in the shadow of that tragedy. When she finally reunited with her father in her teenage years, the relationship was polite but fractured. There was love, yes, but there was also a quiet understanding. Diana's ghost was always between them. Every photograph, every question, every headline. To the world, Charles was the keeper of her legacy. To Kitty, he was the reminder that legacy could destroy anyone who touched it. So when she decided to marry Michael Lewis, a man more than twice her age, it wasn't just a love story, it was defiance. A refusal to let the Spencer name dictate who she could love, what she could be, or how she should live. The public saw a fairy tale wedding, but for the family, it was something else entirely, a turning point. Charles didn't attend. Neither did Diana's sons. The family that once united around a tragedy had now fractured under the weight of wealth, perception, and power. In the weeks that followed, headlines called Kitty the anti-Diana. She wasn't the compassionate people's princess, they said. She was an heiress who traded empathy for image. Every gown she wore, every brand she represented, became ammunition for those who believed she had abandoned the soul that made the Spencers loved in the first place. But what those critics ignored was how much Diana herself had warned of this. Diana once said that her greatest fear was seeing her family consumed by the same fame that killed her. Kitty had grown up knowing that. She'd seen her father haunted by it. She'd seen her mother broken by it. And so, she chose a different kind of armor, control, discretion, and luxury. But not everyone saw it that way. Online, debates about her motives turned bitter. Some argued she was simply living life on her own terms. Others saw her as a symbol of how privilege insulated the Spencers from the empathy Diana once embodied. Reddit threads and tabloid forums accused her of marrying for money, of deliberately distancing herself from Diana's sons, and of ignoring the humanitarian work that defined her aunt. And yet behind the noise, there was a pattern that most missed entirely. Kitty wasn't trying to erase Diana's legacy, she was trying to survive it. In one interview, when asked why she rarely spoke about her aunt, Kitty gave an answer that many overlooked. She said, "It's something very private and deeply personal to my family." It sounded simple, but within that sentence was a lifetime of grief she'd never been allowed to process publicly. To speak of Diana meant reopening wounds the family had never fully healed. To align herself too closely with her aunt's memory would mean inheriting not just admiration, but the curse that came with it. Still, the silence fed the public's fascination. Every move she made was dissected for traces of Diana. The tilt of her head, the shape of her eyes, even the way she smiled in photographs, all became symbols of what she represented. And when Kitty began aligning herself with luxury fashion houses and old money circles, people said she had chosen status over sincerity. What they didn't realize was that Kitty's world had always been a contradiction. The Spencer name gave her power, but it also came with invisible chains. The media wanted her to mourn like Diana, but live like an aristocrat. She couldn't do both. When Kitty moved quietly into philanthropy, she chose her causes carefully. Mental health, children's welfare, women's education, subtle echoes of Diana's legacy. But she did it privately, almost discreetly, without the cameras, without the performative speeches. To her, good work didn't need validation. To the press, that restraint looked like indifference. The marriage only widened that perception gap. Her husband, Michael Lewis, was a South African-born fashion tycoon whose fortune made him a target for every headline. The age gap became a scandal. The wedding became a debate. Was it love or was it alignment? Some even accused her of deliberately crafting a narrative of distance from the royal circle to avoid the same scrutiny that destroyed her aunt. Yet, the irony was almost poetic. Kitty had become a mirror of the same judgments that once haunted Diana. Only this time, she refused to break under them. Family insiders revealed that Charles had quietly expressed his disappointment over the wedding arrangements, not because of the man she married, but because of what it symbolized. To him, it was another reminder that the family Diana left behind was splintering, each generation further removed from the values she represented. But Kitty wasn't chasing validation from her father, or the press, or the world. For once, she was chasing peace. In her own words, she once said, "I think we're all just trying to find our version of happiness, not someone else's idea of it." For the daughter of a man who lived under perpetual scrutiny, and the niece of a woman who died because of it, that statement wasn't defiance. It was a survival instinct turned philosophy. By her mid-30s, Kitty had mastered the art of distance. Every photo, every statement, every decision was deliberate. The girl who once feared the weight of her family name had now learned to weaponize it, to command attention without confession. Yet behind the curated perfection, there were glimpses of someone who had quietly inherited her aunt's strength, not her wounds. Because beneath all the diamonds and headlines, Lady Kitty Spencer was still the girl who lost her aunt to a world that couldn't love her gently. And now, she was determined not to let it happen again. The more Kitty Spencer tried to separate herself from the ghost of her aunt, the louder that ghost became. Every appearance she made, every interview she avoided, every smile that lingered too long, it all became a point of comparison. The press didn't want Kitty Spencer. They wanted Diana, reborn and unbroken. But Kitty refused to play that role, even as the entire world pushed her toward it. When Meghan Markle entered the royal sphere, the comparisons multiplied. Meghan's defiance, her friction with the palace, her interviews about isolation and control, all echoed Diana's final years. The media watched Kitty closely, waiting for a reaction. She gave them nothing. No statements, no sympathy posts, not even subtle likes on social media. It was total silence. And that silence made people suspicious. Because if Diana's niece couldn't publicly support the woman who seemed to relive her aunt's suffering, then what did that say about her loyalty to the woman the world still mourned? But that was the point. Kitty had seen what happened when women in her family spoke too much. Diana had spoken and paid for it with her peace, her privacy, her life. Kitty's strategy was the opposite. Control the narrative by never participating in it. She understood something the public didn't. Proximity to royalty was a trap. The more you engaged, the more they consumed you. So while Meghan and Harry's story dominated headlines, Kitty focused on hers: fashion, philanthropy, and silence. And yet, the world didn't stop pulling her name into the conversation. By 2022, the online debates had turned ruthless. Some Reddit users claimed she had completely disassociated from Diana's legacy out of vanity. Others argued she was protecting herself from the same toxicity that killed her aunt. But both sides agreed on one thing. Lady Kitty Spencer was not what people expected her to be. They expected vulnerability. They got discipline. They expected emotional transparency. They got curated restraint. And that restraint carried consequences. Her absence from family events, her distance from William and Harry, even her silence during the years of royal controversy, all became symbolic of the Spencer family's quiet fracture. The house that once stood united behind Diana's memory had splintered. Charles Spencer remained loyal to Diana's truth. Her sons carried her emotional legacy, but Kitty built her own world, one untouched by the institution that consumed her aunt. Still, the public kept trying to decode her. Every gown, every trip, every photograph with luxury elites was analyzed like scripture. The wedding in Rome had cemented her as an international figure of wealth, not empathy. But as time passed, something shifted. The fashion world began to see her not as a model, but as a symbol of composure, resilience, and modern aristocracy without the monarchy's chains. For the first time, people began to question whether she had been right all along to keep her distance. Because while Meghan and Harry fought their battles in public, Kitty lived a life untouched by royal scandal. No headlines of feuds, no tabloids dissecting every argument, no tears turned into headlines. It wasn't that she didn't care, it was that she refused to give the world a weapon. But that silence had a cost. Privately, she struggled with the pressure to keep her family name clean while living in an era obsessed with confession. The media demanded vulnerability. Kitty offered discretion. When asked once about public life, she said, "Privacy is a luxury, and I intend to keep it." It sounded elegant, but underneath it was exhaustion. People inside her circle began to notice that Kitty's silence wasn't simply a strategy, it was protection from trauma that the world refused to let her forget. The image of Diana's death, the paparazzi chase, the endless replays of tragedy, those were not distant memories to her. They were inherited, and every time the world demanded that she speak about it, it reopened wounds she never allowed to heal. Then, in 2023, a shift occurred. In a rare interview, Kitty finally acknowledged what the world had speculated for years. She said, "I am proud of my aunt's legacy, but I've spent my life trying to build my own." It was the first time she openly drew a line between admiration and identity. That one statement dismantled decades of speculation. Because for the first time, she didn't sound defensive, she sounded certain. What most people missed was how calculated that confession was. It didn't come from pressure or guilt, it came from clarity. Kitty had reached the point in her life where she no longer needed to prove that distance from Diana didn't mean disloyalty, it meant survival. Her relationship with the Spencer brothers remained quiet. Though Harry and William both maintained public tributes to their mother, Kitty never used her platforms to join them. Insiders suggested there was no bad blood, just distance. But in the royal ecosystem, distance often looks like defiance. And defiance, especially from a woman, always gets labeled as arrogance. Behind the scenes, her fashion career was thriving. She became a global ambassador for luxury brands, her name synonymous with elegance rather than scandal. But even in that success, people found controversy. Critics accused her of flaunting privilege, while her aunt's memory symbolized compassion for the oppressed. It was a contradiction that haunted her public image. Could you honor Diana's legacy while living the very life she ran from? When Lady Kitty Spencer finally spoke, it wasn't through a magazine cover or a palace interview. It wasn't planned or rehearsed. It came quietly during a talk about legacy, love, and the burden of public memory. And in that moment, she confirmed what many had whispered for years, that her silence wasn't arrogance, it was armor. She said, "For most of my life, I've watched what fame did to people I loved. I promised myself I'd never let that happen to me." It was the closest she had ever come to admitting the truth, that being Diana's niece wasn't a privilege, it was a warning. For years, Kitty had walked through life carrying a name that didn't belong entirely to her. Every magazine headline, every introduction, every mention of Diana's niece reminded her that she wasn't seen as herself. She was an echo of someone else's tragedy. And for the longest time, she thought distance would protect her from it. But now, at 34, she understood that silence doesn't erase history, it only reshapes it. Her confession wasn't a scandal. It was an acknowledgement that she loved Diana, admired her deeply, but couldn't live in her shadow any longer. "We don't honor the people we lose by copying them," she said. "We honor them by surviving differently." Those words hit harder than any royal revelation because they spoke to the truth of what every Spencer had been fighting privately for decades, the right to live beyond Diana's story. But that honesty came at a time when her family had already begun to fragment in ways few had seen coming. Her father, Charles Spencer, had retreated once again into privacy, often voicing how difficult it was to protect Diana's memory while navigating a family spread across continents. He had spent years defending her against royal mistreatment, but his own children rarely stood beside him in that crusade. The media painted it as a generational divide, the father loyal to the past, the daughter loyal to the future. But beneath that was exhaustion. Kitty had grown tired of inheriting wounds that weren't hers, the grief that consumed her father, the scrutiny that destroyed her aunt, the expectations that haunted her cousins. None of it was of her making. Yet, she had lived every day as if she owed the world explanations for all of it. At 34, she decided she didn't. What most people didn't realize was that her journey toward peace began years before that statement. Behind the scenes, Kitty had reconnected quietly with her mother, Victoria Lockwood, who had long battled her own struggles with mental health after fleeing the toxic pressures of aristocratic life. Their bond became Kitty's anchor, a reminder that healing wasn't always public, and that sometimes walking away from the spotlight is the bravest thing a woman can do. It was Victoria, not the crown, who taught her that silence could be strength, that private happiness mattered more than public approval. Those lessons shaped the woman Kitty became. She no longer tried to fit the narrative of royal tragedy or fairy tale success. She began to live in the middle, where truth usually hides. The glamour remained, but so did perspective. She shifted her focus toward charity work, mentorship, and the kind of philanthropy that didn't make headlines. Her projects in child welfare and education grew quietly, mirroring Diana's compassion, but not her exposure. In the months after her confession, her interviews carried a different tone. There was less caution, more sincerity. She spoke about identity, about how people mistake privilege for protection, and about how fame doesn't change grief. It only magnifies it. And when asked again about Diana, she said something that silenced even her harshest critics. "She wasn't a myth to me. She was my aunt. I just wish the world had loved her the way they said they did, before it was too late." It was the first time she allowed emotion to surface. For years, people assumed Kitty had erased Diana from her narrative, but the truth was far more painful. She hadn't spoken because every conversation about Diana was a reminder of how cruel the world can be to women who refuse to conform. To talk about her aunt meant reliving the same cruelty that shaped her childhood.